November 1943. Rabaul. The sky burned like a second sun. The roar of engines and explosions merged into a single sound, the sound of an empire breaking. In that light, steel melted, planes exploded, and more than 100 aircraft vanished in fire and smoke, with hundreds more left crippled across the airfields. Within hours, Japan's strongest fortress in the Pacific was torn apart by flame and steel. Warships lay scarred in their own harbor, and over 100,000 soldiers, the pride of the empire, were trapped in the smoke of their own making. But this wasn't just another Allied victory. It was the price of arrogance. Japanese commanders believed Rabaul was untouchable, beyond the reach of American bombers. They concentrated their entire air fleet here, ignored radar limitations, ignored supply lines, and refused to adapt. When the U.S. Navy struck, there was nowhere left to run. Rabaul, the so-called invincible fortress of the South Seas, became a trap of its own design. This is the story of how one strategic mistake buried an entire army and marked the beginning of Japan's downfall in the Pacific. January 1942. While most of the world was still reeling from Pearl Harbor, Japan seized a small island in the Bismarck archipelago called Rabaul. To Tokyo, it wasn't just another base. It was the gateway to the South Pacific. Within months, the empire transformed Rabaul into a fortress unlike any other. Volcanic ridges were hollowed into bunkers. 6 airfields spread across the jungle. Harbors were lined with cruisers and supply ships. Over 100,000 Japanese troops poured in, engineers, pilots, infantry, and naval crews. From the air, Rabaul looked like a steel flower blooming in the Pacific. Its 2 commanders, General Hitoshi Imamura of the 8th Area Army and Admiral Junichi Kusaka of the 11th Air Fleet, believed Rabaul was the empire's southern shield. They called it the impregnable fortress of the South Seas. Every gun, every bomber, every Zero fighter was poured into its defenses. From this bastion, Japan launched operations across New Guinea and the Solomons, striking at American convoys and Allied bases. Tokyo saw Rabaul as proof that its empire was unbreakable. What it did not see was that the war itself had changed. While Japan fortified islands, the United States learned to leap over them, to cut supply lines instead of attacking head-on. By mid-1943, American intelligence stationed Haipio and long-range B-24 reconnaissance flights were already mapping Rabaul's runways and shipping routes in secret. The fortress was being watched, measured, and prepared for destruction. And just as Rabaul reached its peak of power, its commanders made the decision that would seal its fate. In the autumn of 1943, the Allies pushed closer through the Solomon Islands. To Imamura and Kusaka, the answer was simple: bring everything to Rabaul. They ordered the 11th Air Fleet to concentrate nearly 500 to 600 aircraft there. Zero fighters, Betty bombers, Val and Judy dive bombers, even night fighters. To them, this was a masterstroke. With so many planes in one place, they believed they could crush any American landing before it began. But in reality, they had just turned Rabaul into a perfect target. American photo reconnaissance from Bougainville and B-24 overflights revealed hundreds of aircraft parked wing-to-wing on open airfields, a single spark away from disaster. Meanwhile, U.S. carriers were learning to strike from beyond the horizon, their planes able to fly farther and hit harder than Japan ever expected. Imamura dismissed the warnings. He believed American bombers could never reach Rabaul from Guadalcanal or Bougainville. Too far, he said. It's impossible. But technology had moved faster than his beliefs. New Hellcats and Avengers could cover more than 1,000 kilometers with auxiliary tanks. To the Americans, distance was no longer a barrier. It was an invitation. In a matter of weeks, Rabaul was no longer a shield. It was a magnet for destruction. Thousands of pilots waited on crowded runways, unaware that their entire air fleet was about to be torn apart in the span of days. But even a fortress with hundreds of planes is blind if it cannot see the enemy coming. By late October 1943, Rabaul had become the most crowded airbase in the Pacific. Yet it was flying half-blind. Japan had installed a few Type II Mark II radar sets. Crude, short-ranged, and often blinded by the island's storms. They caught glimpses of the enemy, but never long enough to act. Pilots and ground crews often spotted American planes only when they were already overhead. There was no unified warning network, no coordination between the Army and Navy commands. Imamura's headquarters operated on one frequency, Kusaka's on another. Chaos disguised as confidence. Meanwhile, the Americans had perfected early warning. PBY Catalinas and B-24 Liberators patrolled the region daily. Every movement of Rabaul's planes, every convoy that entered its harbor, was logged and relayed to Allied carriers hundreds of miles away. Then came the strike that shattered the illusion. November 2nd, 1943. 5 American carriers, Essex, Bunker Hill, Saratoga, Princeton, and Independence, launched 349 aircraft toward Rabaul. The Japanese scrambled barely 70 planes. They never saw it coming. The morning sky turned black with smoke. Bombs tore through hangars and fuel depots. Pilots trying to take off were shredded by their own burning runways. Within 90 minutes, Japan's invincible fortress lost more aircraft than it had in months of combat. That night, Imamura insisted the damage was temporary. But the truth was clear. Rabaul's defense system had collapsed before the real storm even began. And when a fortress can no longer see, the next thing it loses is blood. The strikes continued day after day. But the real killer wasn't the bombs, it was starvation. By November, the U.S. submarine blockade had strangled every supply line into Rabaul. No fuel, no spare parts, no medicine, no food. Engines rusted under tropical rain. Pilots slept in dugouts, weakened by malaria and hunger. Mechanics tried to keep planes alive with wire and scavenged parts. Each sortie meant one less aircraft that would ever fly again. The Americans, by contrast, replaced losses instantly. New Hellcats and Avengers arrived every week from Bougainville. Ready, rested, refueled. Each raid grew faster, more precise, more devastating. Rabaul's grand citadel had turned into a rusting cage, its stillness broken only by the buzz of approaching engines. Yet the worst was still to come. The sky itself was about to fall. And when it did, even the proudest fortress on earth would have no walls left to hide behind. By mid-November, Rabaul was barely breathing. The men still called it a fortress, but in truth it had become a graveyard, waiting for its headstone. What came next would turn the fortress of Rabaul into a furnace, and pride into ash. November 5th, 1943. The morning began with silence, the kind that makes men uneasy. Then from beyond the horizon came the hum. At first, just a whisper, then a roar. Within minutes, the sky above Rabaul filled with shapes, hundreds of them. Over 200 aircraft from the carriers Saratoga and Princeton broke through the clouds, sunlight flashing off their wings. Fighters, dive bombers, torpedo planes, wave after wave of steel, cutting through clouds like arrows of fire. The sirens at Vunakanau wailed too late. Ground crews shouted, scrambling for cover as the first bombs fell. The earth erupted. Hangars disappeared in fireballs. Oil tanks burst into black fountains. Bomb fragments tore through aircraft lined up wing to wing on the runways. The same concentration that Japan once believed would make them stronger now turned them into a death trap. In the air, it was chaos. Zero fighters clawed upward to meet the incoming Hellcats, their pilots flying with the same courage they always had. But against an enemy they no longer understood. The F-6F Hellcat could dive faster, turn tighter, climb higher. Its armor shrugged off hits that would tear a Zero apart. From the cockpit of one American pilot came the radio call. "They're burning. The whole base is burning." Tracer fire crossed the sky like lightning. One Betty bomber tried to escape over the sea. A Hellcat followed, its guns spitting fire until the bomber exploded in midair, raining debris over Simpson Harbor. Down below, bombs slammed into the docks. The heavy cruisers Otago, Maya, and Takao, the pride of the Imperial Navy, took direct hits. Columns of smoke rose, thousands of feet high, mixing with volcanic ash. A Japanese sailor later wrote, "The air smelled of burning oil and iron. It felt like the island itself was screaming." Within hours, Rabaul's harbor turned into a cauldron of wreckage. Cruisers burned, destroyers listed in the shallows, and the sea itself seemed to boil with debris. Hundreds of aircraft lay shattered or burning on the airfields. But the Americans weren't done. In the days that followed, the raids only grew larger. By November 11, 1943, an armada of American carriers, Essex, Bunker Hill, Independence, and Yorktown, unleashed more than 500 aircraft. For the men on the ground, it was not a battle. It was a storm. The Japanese defenders barely resisted. Anti-aircraft guns barked weakly. Many fighters never left the ground. The Americans had timed their assault perfectly. Low tide, clear weather, maximum payload. Witnesses said the sun vanished behind the smoke. The sky turned orange and black, the ground shaking with every impact. Warehouses detonated one after another, sending shockwaves across the harbor. Fuel depots erupted into pillars of flame so bright that pilots 50 miles away could see them. A mechanic trying to reach his aircraft was thrown by a blast. When he looked up, his plane was gone, replaced by a crater of fire. Inside the command bunkers, Imamura and Kusaka listened through a dying radio network. Messages crackled. Runway destroyed, fuel gone, communications dead. And then silence. Then the echoes faded. What had been thunder became stillness. When the last wave of Avengers pulled away, Rabaul was no longer a stronghold, but a ruin smoldering in its own ashes. For the 100,000 men stationed there, it was not just a battlefield. It was their prison. The fires would burn for days, but the fortress was finished. The Americans lost fewer than 20 aircraft. The Japanese lost well over 100. And with them, the will to fight for the skies. That night, the horizon glowed red for hours. Even from the sea, sailors aboard U.S. destroyers said the island looked like a burning volcano of metal. The next morning, Admiral Kusaka ordered all remaining ships capable of moving to retreat toward Truk. The once mighty bastion of the South Seas was abandoned, left to rot in its own smoke. For the vast garrison still trapped inside, there would be no evacuation, no resupply, no escape. Rabaul, once the spearhead of an empire, had become a tomb sealed by its own arrogance. A pilot who survived the inferno wrote weeks later, "We did not die from American bombs, we died from Japanese pride." And perhaps he was right. When the last fires died down, Rabaul was no longer a fortress. It was a graveyard, one that still held over 100,000 men, cut off from the world they had fought for. The Americans never needed to invade. They simply turned Rabaul into an island of silence, a place where men faded slowly into history. By early 1944, the once feared 11th Air Fleet was only a shadow of what it had been. Its runways lined with wrecks, its pilots grounded by hunger and exhaustion. The citadel of the South Seas had become a warning written in smoke. With Rabaul neutralized, the United States advanced unchecked across the Pacific. Truk, Saipan, Leyte, each fell in turn, each echoing the same mistake. Japan's doctrine of concentration, of standing fast to the last man, became its undoing. Rabaul was not destroyed by bombs alone. It was destroyed by a mindset, a refusal to adapt, to divide, to change. Even after surrender, Rabaul remained frozen in time. When Australian forces entered in 1945, they found a city of tunnels, wrecked aircraft, and thousands of soldiers still at their posts. No rescue had ever come. No one even tried. Today, the jungle has swallowed most of it. You can still walk through those tunnels, the walls blackened by soot, the air heavy with silence. Rusting Zero fighters lie half-buried under vines, their aluminum skin peeling like old bones. And carved into the concrete of one surviving bunker are 4 words left by an unknown soldier. We believe too much. History would call Rabaul the Pacific's greatest fortress. But to those who fought there, it was something else. A monument to hubris, to the blindness of command, to the cost of never questioning orders. Not every fortress falls to enemy fire. Some collapse under the weight of their own arrogance. Rabaul did both, burned from above and hollowed from within. Every empire has its Rabaul, the moment when belief outlives reality. So when you hear the name Rabaul, remember not the power it once held, but the silence it left behind. What do you think was Japan's greatest mistake in the Pacific War? Tell us in the comments and join Fireline, where every lost battle tells the truth of how empires fall.